Hello, my guest is Rabbi Mark Solomon, who is a distinguished rabbinical leader in Great Britain, in Edinburgh, and in the Leister Jewish community. I wonder how, Rabbi Solomon, did your faith guide you in your work in campaigning for LGBT rights?
Thanks, Joe. That's a very interesting question. In some ways, it was life that led me there. It was the process that any LGBT person goes through at some point in their life of coming out, of accepting who I was. And certainly in the initial stages, for many years, I suppose, it was really, really tough because the whole tradition of Jewish faith and certainly of Orthodox Judaism that I was a part of and was brought up in is very, very negative about lesbian or gay and identity. And so I had this whole weight of tradition on top of me, and yet I knew I had, feelings that were not approved of, and so it was a matter of struggle to cope with this, and for many years it had to be kept secret, and certainly when I was in the final stages of training as an Orthodox rabbi, that in my mid-20s, that is exactly when and I know it's the same for many people, felt I needed to come to terms with who I was and to acknowledge it, and that created a terrible struggle. So where did faith come into it? It was a long process of reading, of meeting people. I think for me, one of the key healing moments was encountering the late Rabbi Lionel Blue, whom some people might remember. He was on the radio, on TV. He's a wonderful man, a great man. He was the first rabbi to come out in Britain, one of the first in the world, and he was a Reform rabbi, but a wonderfully warm, funny, humane person. And I'll never forget having made an appointment to go and see him in his house in Finchley, walking into his room, and this cherubic smiling face saying, "Hello, Ducky." Wow, no rabbi's ever called me Ducky before, and that began a wonderful friendship in which he supported me in so many ways, and I began meeting people to whom I could be out. I couldn't at that time in my everyday life, but amongst some people I was able to. And finding that acceptance from religious people, from spiritual people, is a big first step in reconciling one's faith and tradition with one's sexuality. And then another important stage was reading Jewish feminist literature, books about how women who had struggled for their place, for their equality within Judaism, were expressing their sense of spirituality and recognizing so much in common between this feminist struggle and my gay struggle, I suppose. And it was not just mine. I knew many other people were involved in that as well. And um, and that brought with it a different sense of what God could be. I suppose in my traditional Jewish upbringing, God was always primarily the lawgiver, the source of commandments, of prohibitions, of judgment. And of course, there is a loving side of God as well, very strongly in Judaism. But when you know you're struggling with something that is not approved of, it's the judgment that you feel most strongly. And it was through these feminist writings, not just Jewish, but other feminist writings as well. Alice Walker, in her wonderful novel, The Color Purple, which is about the liberation of the spirit, I came to recognize that there was a better, deeper, truer way of looking at God than the rather narrow one that I think that I was struggling with. And that came as a huge liberation and revelation to me, and helped me to break out of the limitations that I was living with at the time and find a new path, a more freer path to express my Judaism and my rabbinic identity. And there was one moment, I'll just tell you this, there was one moment when I was rabbi in the Watford community just to the north of London. And it was one Friday night, one Sabbath meal. I was sitting on my own. You normally have the Sabbath meal with other people, but on this occasion I was on my own, cooked my meal, I'd had my meal, said the prayers and the blessings. And then, without any conscious decision, I just spoke out loud and said, "Thank you, Eibishter, for making me gay." Now, Eibishter is a Yiddish word for God that I love very much. Thank you, Eibishter. And I thought, what? Why did I say that? Where did that come from? Up to that moment, I hadn't been aware that this was something to be grateful, to be thankful to God for. And that came to me as this moment of, I suppose my subconscious had worked this through to the point where I could recognize this wasn't a curse. This wasn't something evil that I had to deal with. It was actually a blessing. It was a deep part of me through which I could express love and care for other people. And that was something to be thankful for.
Wonderful. I have never heard such a deep and profound connection between LGBT, gay, Judaism, and even feminism. And I just wonder, going forward, how do you think faith communities can be catalysts for change in not only accepting, but, there's a big movement now, Rabbi Solomon, about it's not enough not to be a racist, you must be an anti-racist. How can communities such as the ones you lead and others be a catalyst for this kind of positive change?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is that the world at large, our relatively secular society, often assumes that religions are forces for conservatism, forces for limitation of people's choices and identities, that religions are going to be patriarchal, as historically they mostly have been, of course, that religions are going to be homophobic, and anti this and anti that. And I think that therefore, when a religious community comes out publicly, very positively, as embracing a sort of radical inclusivity and egalitarian approach, whether it's between men and women, whether it's between straight and LGBT plus, then the impact of that in society is even greater, because it kind of takes people by surprise, and it's always a good thing to surprise people. They expect religions to be saying, no, you can't, and no, we don't. And when you say, yes, we can, and yes, we are, I think the impact of that is greater than if some, a civil servant or somebody like that says it, important though those changes in politics and in law are as well. But with religion, it makes that extra little bit of impact, I hope, I think.
You're a perfect example of that, because at Sukkat Shalom, the synagogue that you lead here in Edinburgh, the number of members has increased exponentially, significantly, with a large percentage from the LGBT plus community as well, because you opened the doors, opened the eyes to so many people. It couldn't have been easy. So I'm wondering, what challenging times have you had within your life? Go back to Sydney, go back to London, that you've been able to walk through that challenging time with faith. How has faith helped you to get over some of these very challenging times?
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge, probably, I've faced a number, as everybody has in their life. Everyone who's lived has had all kinds of different challenges. I suppose for me, coming out was the biggest and sort of longest lasting of those challenges, and struggling through that. And I've said a little bit about it. But there have been others as well, challenges of loneliness, challenges of feelings of depression that I know many people experience. And I think that there's a strong sense for me in which God is the force of being against non-being.
Mm.
Now that sounds very abstract, I know, but that God is the force that makes for the greatest abundance and variety and intensity of being. And it's holding on to that sense that it's better to be than not to be,
Mhm.
to paraphrase perhaps a famous Shakespeare passage. Yeah, it's better to be than not to be. That even when you think that life is really hopeless, that you can only see darkness ahead, that there is always a glimmer of light to hold on to. That glimmer, you can call it God, you can call it the strength of the human spirit, you can call it, you know, the universe, being itself. But that's what pulls me forward, I think, and that's what I suppose I'd urge people to hold on to that spark of being that is always there if we'll allow ourselves to feel it, to be drawn towards it. Um, I've had professional crises as well. I'm not going to go into details, but places I've worked where things have not gone so well, and that's been a terrible shock, and it makes you think, am I doing the right thing? Am I really qualified to be a rabbi, a spiritual leader? Um, has this all gone terribly wrong? And I think then I turned for help partly to people within my own community who were huge towers of strength for me, but also to two particular friends at that time, one Muslim and one Christian, Roman Catholic, who also had their challenges, and it was their companionship, their inspiration, that helped to give me a sense that no, I was worthy, whatever the challenges had happened, that that didn't mean that I was sort of a hopeless case, but that I still had something really positive to offer. So for me, again, coming back to the theme of interfaith that we discussed the other day, is that sense that light, that force of being, isn't just within one's own narrow circle, but is actually spread more widely, and you can get that strength from different places,
Mm.
from people of
I,
other faiths.
yes, and I wonder if you have any personal recommendations or professional recommendations for folks throughout the world who are tuning into this broadcast who are suffering from anxiety and depression during this terrible coronavirus period that could be further rooted in faith. Any recommendations you have?
I think one of the most wonderful things I've experienced during this time is the way in which religious communities have adapted. Some of the deepest things we do are about bringing people together in a sacred space, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a temple, and giving people a sense of community. And suddenly that was all taken away, and it was a horrible crisis within our communities, as well as the obvious health crisis that everybody was experiencing. And yet somehow we grouped really quite quickly, I think, and managed to create online communities. And those online communities, through Zoom, through whatever platforms people have used, through Facebook streaming, through YouTube, have reached out to people who didn't usually come into the synagogue or the church or the mosque. People who may be geographically distant, who may be disabled and not able to get to places of worship, but suddenly from their own homes they could access this world of spiritual support. Now, I know it's difficult for people. Not everybody has access to the technology. Some people find this way of communicating through a computer screen or a phone screen not very satisfying, but the support is there. The opportunities are there. I would urge people to surf the net, to seek out these opportunities, to join a congregation, and it might be a congregation on the other side of the world in a different time zone, but somehow that might be the place that can speak to you right now. And I've heard wonderful stories of people feeling really grateful that they suddenly had this access, this richness, this variety that wasn't there before.
What a great example. I heard another rabbi once say that the reason that the attendance for live face-to-face events has started to go down is because God has moved. God now is online. And evidence of that is what's happened in the pandemic, because we've seen an increase in numbers of more people actually coming together through technology. So I would like to close by asking you to describe, you've talked about God many times today, including the traditional view of the giver of the commandments, the punisher, etc. What is your personal view of the divine? I'll just start by saying that as I've aged, my view of God has changed, as I think happens to a lot of people as they age. And my view of belief or faith, divine, if you will, is about me improving my work as a human being on earth to be of greater service to others. It's not necessarily belief in some image or icon or even words. But I was wondering, what is your view of God?
Wow, well, that is a big question. I'm happy to have a go at answering it fairly briefly, but and my answer might be a little bit shocking to some people, I suppose, because as I have grown older and faced I think, facing people's insistent questions for years and years and years of why do we suffer when God is good and benevolent? Why is there so much undeserved suffering in the world? And our religious traditions provide all kinds of answers, some of them very profound and helpful answers. But I have to say, there came a point for me a few years ago when those answers that I was giving were no longer convincing me. And so the idea that there is a being out there um, who is watching over us, who is relating to each of us in a personal way, who is somehow the guide and the architect of our lives, no longer felt true to me. And so this belief in a personal God who somehow presides over so much sickness and suffering and conflict and pandemics that slay countless innocent and good people, I just could no longer accept that model. And I found great comfort in Jewish thinkers of the past, and as some great Jewish thinkers and others of our time as well, who have put forward the idea of a more impersonal sense of the divine. So God is not a person out there who is willing this to happen or that to happen and following some inscrutable divine plan. I don't believe in that anymore. I know that's a faith that is really important to many people, and I respect their faith, and I try not to disturb people's deep faith in that sort of personal God. But for me, God is being itself. Our great philosopher Spinoza, who was excommunicated as a heretic back in the 17th century, said God or nature, that nature is the expression of divine power, of divine energy, of divine force, whether it brings us good things or things that we experience as terrible and harmful, like viruses that suddenly break out and attack us. It's not a question that is planned or willed. It's not, doesn't come as a judgment or as a punishment. It's just part of being, part of nature doing its thing. But we are part of nature as well. Our thinking minds, our will to do good, as well as our will to do evil. This is all part of nature. But if God is the force of being, then I believe that the voice of God speaking in us is the voice of being itself, calling us to be, to exist, to live in the fullest sense, which means in a sense of unity and cooperation with other people. Because if we live for ourselves alone, then our lives are small and limited. However rich we and powerful we may become, if it's just for ourselves, to gratify ourselves, then we are actually limiting being. And only in cooperating with others, reaching out to the force of being within them, do we discover sort of the depth, the breadth, the full freedom and variety of being. And I think that is a deeply moral voice of the divine within us, not in a personal sense. There's a strong strand in Jewish tradition that says, as soon as you think of God as being like a person, you've constructed a false image of God. That God is not like us. God is the largest, the greatest, the totality of all being, and we recognize ourselves as part of that. I think that's the deep mystical impulse at the very heart of all religion, is the sense that is the sense of oneness. The Judaism has at its very heart that biblical statement, Adonai Echad, the Lord is one. And there are many different ways of understanding that, but my way of understanding it is that all is one, that we are all one. We are all so deeply interconnected, interrelated through the energy of being, of the energy of the universe that runs through us, that unites us to everything else. Only in a sense of that greater unity do we sense the divine. Now, I know that might sound very abstract to people, but
No.
that's my faith. That's my faith that keeps me going.
We agree in terms of faith and being. What I find today is so many people, the Edinburgh Interfaith Association has been developed for 30 years for those of all faiths and none. And those who say they have no faith, I always question that, because I think everyone believes in something, their own belief system. Thank you for sharing your beliefs with us today. And for those of you that are tuning in, I invite you to join Rabbi Mark Solomon at our services at Sukkat Shalom, the Liberal Synagogue here in Edinburgh. You can find information about those services at www.eljc.org. That's www.eljc.org. And Rabbi Solomon also organizes and delivers exciting courses for people who are Jewish, have been Jewish, have a relative who's Jewish, who have never been Jewish, have no connection, entitled Introduction to Judaism. And I hope you'll visit the website and join us for one of those as well. Rabbi, on behalf of the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, thank you for reminding us that there is something bigger than ourselves. There's faith and there's being. And when it comes, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much, Joe. Shabbat Shalom to you and to Nancy. And thank you so much for what has been a really exciting and deep interview. Thank you, Joe.